The evening was dim, with flickering streetlights casting shadows on the deserted street. This neighborhood, often whispered about in the police force, was labeled a haven for troublemakers. Ethan Miller, a young cop with just 2 years on the job, was all too familiar with such talk. He was frequently assigned to patrol areas considered dangerous, low-income neighborhoods populated mostly by black residents or immigrants. Ethan sat in his patrol car, his eyes scanning the street through the windshield. His hand idly played with a shiny pair of steel handcuffs, a habit whenever he felt restless. Echoing in his mind were the words of his colleagues. These neighborhoods are full of trouble. Don't trust anyone. As Ethan's gaze swept across a narrow alley, he spotted an elderly black man walking slowly. The man wore a worn coat, his shaky hands clutching a paper bag. It was Elijah Walker, a resident of the area for over 30 years. Though Elijah was simply on his way home after buying a few daily necessities, his presence immediately aroused Ethan's suspicion. He's hiding something, Ethan thought to himself. Without hesitation, he pushed open the car door, stepped out, and called out loudly, "Hey, old man, stop right there." Elijah turned, surprise evident in his eyes. His deliberate pace only deepened Ethan's mistrust. Approaching him, Ethan rested his hand on the holstered gun at his side, as if ready to draw it at any moment. "What are you doing here? You know this area has a curfew against loitering, don't you?" Ethan demanded coldly. Elijah, his voice deep and steady, tried to remain calm. "I'm just heading home. I'm not loitering or doing anything wrong." But that wasn't enough for Ethan. He began interrogating Elijah about the bag he was carrying, insisting that he open it. Reluctantly, Elijah complied, revealing harmless items: a loaf of bread, carton of milk, and some vegetables. Yet Ethan wasn't satisfied. "This is just a cover," Ethan said, his tone icy. "What else are you hiding?" Elijah paused for a moment, his eyes filled with quiet sadness. "You don't trust me because I'm black, do you?" The words hit Ethan like a sharp blade, but he quickly brushed them off. "Don't pull the race card on me. I'm just doing my job." Ethan began patting down Elijah's coat pockets, causing the old man to stagger slightly. A small crowd started to gather from a distance, watching silently but too afraid to intervene. "You'll regret this," Elijah said, his voice hoarse but firm. Before turning and walking away, Ethan returned to his patrol car, a swirl of emotions churning inside him. He didn't believe he had done anything wrong. Yet the image of the old man's sorrowful eyes lingered in his mind, trying to shake the thought. Ethan turned on the radio, but the blaring noise only heightened his tension. Meanwhile, Elijah walked slowly home. His house, a small and modest one at the end of the street, was surrounded by towering old trees. Though simple, the home was filled with memories. In the living room, a large framed photo sat prominently on a wooden shelf. A young man in a police uniform, standing tall with a confident smile. It was Daniel Walker, Elijah's only son, now the city's police chief. Elijah sank into a chair and placed the paper bag on the table. He didn't turn on the lights, letting the faint glow from the window bathe the room in soft shadows. Memories, painful and vivid, surged back. Memories he had tried hard to bury. Years ago, Elijah had been a social activist, fighting for black civil rights. He had endured beatings, arrests, and humiliation for daring to demand justice. Yet, through it all, he never let hatred consume his heart. That same spirit had inspired Daniel to pursue a career in law enforcement, with the hope of changing the system from within. Elijah stared at the photo of Daniel, his thoughts heavy. "Son, I don't want you to feel ashamed of me, but I can't stay silent in the face of these injustices either." The next day, Ethan arrived at the police station as usual. No one mentioned the incident from the previous night, and Ethan preferred it that way. He told himself it would blow over, that no one cared about an unknown old man. In a corner office, Police Chief Daniel Walker was engrossed in reviewing reports. known for his fairness and integrity. Daniel was a respected leader among his colleagues. But today, he seemed more pensive than usual. On his desk lay an anonymous complaint detailing the events of the previous night. Attached was a video taken by a witness on their phone. Daniel played the video. The footage showed Ethan shoving Elijah, his tone harsh and condescending. Every detail was unmistakable. Daniel's eyes darkened, and his hands clenched into fists. Later that afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived at the police station. Elijah Walker. He stepped into Daniel's office. His eyes filled with a mix of sadness and resolve. "Daniel, I need to talk to you." Daniel stood abruptly, shocked to see his father. "Dad? What are you doing here?" "Son," Elijah began, his voice calm but firm. "I just experienced something I can't stay silent about." Elijah recounted the events of the previous night in detail. He didn't hide his disappointment. Not just with Ethan, but with the system Daniel represented. Daniel listened, his eyes darkening with every word his father spoke. Each sentence felt like a dagger to his sense of pride and integrity. "I don't want to blow this out of proportion," Elijah said, his gaze steady on his son. "But, son, I can't let this be forgotten." Daniel took a deep breath. He knew he had to address the situation. But it wasn't just a professional decision. It was a test of his courage and commitment to justice. He called Ethan into his office and demanded an explanation. Ethan entered, unaware he was walking into a storm. When his eyes met Elijah's, his face turned pale. Yet, stubbornly, he said, "I was just doing my job." Daniel's voice was firm, his tone cutting through the air. "Your job is not to humiliate an innocent man." Under the weight of Daniel's authority and Elijah's disappointed gaze, Ethan fell silent. Daniel ordered Ethan to take a temporary leave while an investigation was conducted. With no other choice, Ethan complied. But inside, he was seething with anger. Daniel sat silently in his office after Ethan left. Anger and disappointment simmered within him like an unrelenting fire. He knew suspending Ethan wouldn't sit well with all his colleagues, especially those who shared Ethan's mindset. But he didn't care. To Daniel, justice could never bow to prejudice or fear. Meanwhile, Ethan returned home in a foul mood. He shoved the door open, slammed his police hat onto the table, and collapsed into a chair. Daniel's words echoed in his mind. "Your job is not to humiliate an innocent man." Picking up his phone, Ethan called a fellow officer, Lucas, someone who often shared his conservative views. Over the phone, Ethan vented about his suspension, his frustration spilling out. "Can you believe this? All I did was my job. And now I'm suspended because of some black old man." Lucas lowered his voice, offering sympathy. "Don't worry, Ethan. You didn't do anything wrong. This is just politics. Guys like us are always painted as the villains when we try to maintain order." Ethan felt reassured by Lucas's words. But deep down, a flicker of doubt began to grow. Somewhere within, he knew his defense didn't entirely hold up to scrutiny. That evening, Elijah sat alone in his small room, the light from an old desk lamp casting a soft glow on his contemplative face. He opened a wooden box on the shelf and pulled out faded photographs. The images showed a younger Elijah, standing in the midst of a protesting crowd, holding signs demanding equality. The memories washed over him like a slow-motion reel. In 1968, Elijah had been a passionate young man living in the American South, where racial segregation was still a harsh reality. He participated in protests against Jim Crow laws, organizing marches that were often met with violent police crackdowns. Elijah had witnessed his best friend beaten to death for daring to proclaim that all people are born equal. Those years had shaped Elijah into the man he was. Despite enduring so much pain, he was determined not to let hatred cloud his ideals. That was why, when Daniel decided to become a police officer, Elijah didn't stand in his way. He wanted his son to use the power of the law to protect the innocent, not oppress them. Back in the present, Elijah set the photo down, his heart heavy. He knew Ethan wasn't the first to treat him that way, but this time, he felt a shift in the air. The incident had already gained traction on social media, and Elijah believed this was his chance to speak out. Ethan Miller sat quietly in his small living room. The TV blared the evening news, but he wasn't paying attention. His mind was clouded with frustration and a deep sense of failure. The phone on the table lit up repeatedly, buzzing with notifications from social media, but he couldn't bring himself to look. He knew all too well what awaited him there. Since the video of the incident went viral, Ethan had become the center of public outrage. The media highlighted his actions as a prime example of police abuse of power, and forums and social media were flooded with harsh criticism. This is exactly the kind of cop we don't need. He's the reason people don't trust law enforcement. Each comment, each piece of condemnation, felt like a dagger stabbing into Ethan. He had once been proud of his job, thinking of himself as a protector of order. Now, he felt like the entire world was against him. He picked up his phone and called Lucas, his closest colleague at the precinct. After a few rings, Lucas answered. "This is getting out of hand." "Lucas," Ethan said, his voice a mix of anger and worry. "I was just doing my job, and now they're treating me like a criminal." Lucas tried to reassure him, his tone calm. "You didn't do anything wrong, Ethan. This is just the media and those so-called justice warriors playing their games. They needed a scapegoat, and you were unlucky enough to be it. But I've been suspended. Do you know what that means? My entire career is at stake." Ethan snapped, his frustration boiling over. Lucas lowered his voice, almost to a whisper. "Don't worry, I have an idea. We can turn this around. Let's dig into the old man's past. Maybe he has a record or something shady in his history. All we need is a little dirt, and the public will stop siding with him." Ethan listened to Lucas's suggestion but didn't respond immediately. The idea was tempting, but it left him feeling uneasy. Something inside him was conflicted. He knew he wasn't entirely innocent in this situation, but his anger, shame, and isolation made it hard to confront his mistakes. That night, Ethan struggled to sleep. The image of Elijah Walker kept appearing in his mind. The old man's weary, sorrowful eyes seemed to stare straight at him, a quiet reminder that not everyone could simply be forgotten. A week after the incident, Ethan received a summons from Police Chief Daniel Walker. He walked into the station with a heavy heart. The atmosphere in the meeting room was cold and tense, as if all eyes were on him. Colleagues avoided looking directly at Ethan, and some openly distanced themselves. Daniel stood in the center of the room, one hand gripping a stack of files, the other holding a fountain pen tightly. His face bore an unyielding expression of sternness. As Ethan entered, Daniel motioned for him to sit. The room fell silent, the only sound being the rustle of papers as Daniel flipped through the file. "Ethan," Daniel began, his voice low and commanding. "I've seen the video. I've also received dozens of calls from the media and members of the community. Do you know what they're saying?" Ethan lowered his head, remaining silent. "They're saying your actions are unacceptable, and I agree with them." Daniel paused, his sharp gaze boring into Ethan, cutting through any defense he might muster. "I don't care what you think, but here's the reality. The video speaks for itself. You abused your authority, hurt an elderly man, and tarnished the reputation of this entire police department." Ethan felt his throat dry up. He wanted to defend himself, to say he was just doing his job, but he knew any words he uttered now would only make things worse. Daniel continued, "I've decided we need to handle this matter publicly. The trust of the community is paramount, and if we don't act transparently, we'll lose it." Ethan looked up, his eyes wide. "What are you planning to do?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Tomorrow, we're holding a press conference," Daniel said firmly. "You'll face the public, answer their questions, and take responsibility for your actions." "What?" Ethan shot up, his face flushing red. "This is a joke, right? I'm not a criminal to be paraded around for the public to ridicule. Daniel remained unyielding. You're not a criminal, but you're not a victim either. Ethan, this is your chance to make amends, or at least show that you're willing to take responsibility. Ethan said nothing more. He left the room, his steps heavy as if carrying the weight of the sky on his shoulders. The next day, the press conference took place in a large auditorium downtown. Journalists from all over gathered, armed with cameras and microphones as sharp as swords. When Ethan stepped onto the stage, the flashing lights from hundreds of cameras blinded him momentarily. Daniel stood beside him, a figure of authoritative presence but also one of stern oversight. The conference began, and the questions came like relentless waves. Do you regret your actions? What made you think you had the right to humiliate an innocent elderly man? Do you think your behavior reflects the values of the entire police force? Ethan lowered his head, unable to respond immediately. Sweat trickled down his forehead, and his hands trembled with the weight of the moment. Finally, he looked up, meeting the gaze of the reporters. I was wrong, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper but echoing across the room. I acted inappropriately, and I will take responsibility. The room fell silent for a moment before murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. While Ethan's words weren't enough to quell public outrage, they marked the first step he had to take. As the press conference ended, Ethan left in silence. He knew the road ahead would be anything but easy, but at least he had begun to confront the truth. Bright sunlight streamed through the windows of Police Chief Daniel Walker's office, but the atmosphere inside remained cold and heavy. Daniel sat behind his desk, a thick file on Ethan Miller open before him. Next to it lay a stack of documents from the city's complaints department, detailing hundreds of submissions demanding an investigation into the police force. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. He wasn't just the chief of police. He was a symbol of justice for the community. Now, he faced a challenge far greater than his career: how to protect the integrity of the force he led, while upholding the ethical principles and social responsibility he believed in. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant stepped in, holding a sheet of paper. Chief Walker. Elijah Walker's attorney has just sent notice that he's filing a lawsuit against Ethan Miller for abuse of power and human rights violations. Daniel looked up, his sharp eyes flashing with resolve. I anticipated this. The community has every right to demand justice, and so does my father. We need to ensure this investigation is fully transparent. But, sir, the assistant hesitated. If this lawsuit gains traction, the reputation of the entire police department will be at stake. The media won't miss a single detail. Daniel rose from his chair, locking eyes with his assistant. I understand that, but the truth must come to light, no matter the cost. If we don't stand for justice now, we'll lose the trust of the people forever. Meanwhile, Ethan sat in his apartment, staring at the morning newspaper. The bold headline read, "Black man sues police over assault." It felt as though the ground beneath him had collapsed. While Lucas and a few colleagues had tried to comfort him, their reassurances did little to quell the gnawing guilt and anxiety consuming him. The first day of the trial saw the courtroom packed to capacity. Journalists lined both sides, cameras fixed on the central figure of the proceedings, Elijah Walker, dressed in a simple but well-tailored suit. His face was calm, though his eyes gleamed with unwavering determination. Ethan was also present, his face tense and gaunt, sitting beside his lawyer, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. It felt as if the entire world was staring at him, judging his every move. Elijah's lawyer began with the opening statement. Your Honor, today we are here not only to restore the dignity of an elderly man, but to seek justice for all those who have endured systemic injustices. The prosecution presented clear evidence: the video from the incident and eyewitness testimonies, the footage of Ethan shoving Elijah, coupled with his condescending tone, played to a tense and silent courtroom. Every second of the video felt like a dagger to Ethan's dignity. and he couldn't bring himself to lift his head or meet anyone's eyes. When it was time for Ethan's lawyer to speak, he attempted to argue that Ethan's actions were a momentary lapse in judgment, not a product of racial bias. However, the defense's explanations seemed unconvincing in the face of the damning evidence. During the lunch break, Ethan sat silently in a corner of the courtroom. His gaze drifted toward Elijah, who was speaking quietly with his lawyer. In that moment, Ethan realized that the older man wasn't seeking revenge. Elijah's calm demeanor was a reminder that justice wasn't a weapon to strike others down. It was a light meant to illuminate the truth. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, his mind flooded with images from the first day of the trial. The words of Elijah's lawyer echoed in his head. The defendant's actions are a clear example of abuse of power within law enforcement. He sat up abruptly, walked over to his desk, and opened his laptop. Ethan began searching for information about Elijah Walker. Old articles surfaced, recounting the story of a man who had tirelessly fought for equality. Elijah wasn't just an ordinary elderly man. He was a symbol of resilience against injustice. Ethan felt a growing sense of respect for Elijah, but alongside it came a deepening shame for his own actions. He asked himself, "Why did I treat someone like him that way? How can I possibly make this right?" The next morning, Ethan arrived at the courthouse with a tired expression. He knew he couldn't turn back time, but he was determined to do something to atone for his mistake, even if it was just a small step forward. On the second day of the trial, Daniel Walker entered the courtroom. His presence immediately drew attention. As both the police chief and Elijah's son, Daniel was at the center of the case, even though he had made every effort to remain impartial. When called to testify, Daniel didn't shy away. He recounted what he had seen in the video and emphasized the importance of holding the police force accountable for misconduct. "As a leader, I cannot condone behavior like this," Daniel said, his voice firm and resolute. "And as a son, it pains me deeply to know that my father had to endure this." Daniel's words left the courtroom in silence. Even Elijah couldn't hide his emotion. He looked at his son, his gaze a mix of pride and sorrow. As the session ended, Elijah approached Ethan. He stood in front of him for a long moment before speaking in a deep, steady voice. "You made a mistake, but that doesn't mean you can't make it right." Ethan was at a loss for words. His eyes welled with tears, and for the first time, a faint glimmer of hope began to flicker in his heart. The next morning, Ethan woke up earlier than usual. He had spent the entire night tossing and turning, wrestling with his own conscience. Elijah's words echoed in his mind. "You made a mistake, but that doesn't mean you can't make it right." It wasn't just a reminder. It felt like an opportunity for Ethan to start over. Ethan decided to meet with his lawyer before the next court session. He wanted to tell the truth, to take responsibility for what he had done. When Ethan shared his intentions, his lawyer was visibly surprised. "Ethan, are you sure? If you confess, you could lose everything, your job, your reputation, even your freedom," the lawyer said, trying to persuade him to reconsider. Ethan was silent for a moment before nodding. "Yes, but I can't live my life carrying this weight. I was wrong, and I want to do what's right." That day in the courtroom, Ethan was called to the stand. All eyes were on him, expecting the usual justifications or excuses. But this time, Ethan's voice was steady. He looked directly at Elijah and said, "I was wrong. I acted inappropriately, and I abused my authority. There's no excuse for what I did. All I can say is that I deeply regret my actions." The courtroom fell silent. No one had anticipated that Ethan, who had spent so long avoiding responsibility, would stand up and admit his wrongdoing in front of everyone. Elijah watched him, his gaze softening. Perhaps this was the moment he had been waiting for. After Ethan's confession, the trial entered a critical phase. While he had admitted his wrongdoing, Ethan still had to face the legal consequences of his actions. The lawyers continued to debate the extent of his responsibility and the appropriate punishment. Elijah had no intention of pushing Ethan to ruin. He wasn't seeking revenge. In a private meeting with his legal team, Elijah said, "I don't want him to serve an unnecessarily long sentence. What I want is for this system to change, so no one else has to go through what I did." The lawyers agreed with Elijah's perspective and shifted their focus toward demanding systemic reforms rather than solely punishing Ethan. They proposed that the police department implement mandatory training on unbiased conflict resolution and establish an independent oversight committee to review police misconduct. Daniel Walker, though not directly involved in the trial, had already begun initiating these reforms within the police department. He held meetings with his subordinates, emphasizing that their actions would be monitored more closely moving forward. "We cannot let these mistakes happen again," Daniel told them. "If anyone feels they can't work under these new principles, they are free to leave now." Daniel's resolve created a sense of unease among some in the force, but he didn't care. To him, these changes were necessary, and he was prepared to risk his career to ensure they were implemented. News of Elijah's lawsuit and Ethan's confession spread far and wide, not just within the city but across the entire country. Human rights organizations and social activists began organizing marches, calling for widespread police reform. The slogan "Justice for Elijah" appeared on banners, across social media, and even on major television programs. Meanwhile, Elijah was invited to speak at numerous events, where he shared his story and called for unity in the fight for a more equitable society. He spoke not only about the pain he had endured but also about his hope that younger generations would do better. "I don't want us to live in perpetual hatred," Elijah said during a talk at a local church. "I want us to learn to forgive, but also to fight for what is right." Ethan, though no longer in the public eye, watched everything unfold from afar. He felt a deep sense of shame for becoming a negative symbol, but at the same time, he was grateful that Elijah hadn't made him an enemy. The old man's words had not only helped Ethan see the error of his ways, but also inspired him to begin making amends. The final day of the trial arrived amidst a tense atmosphere. The courtroom was packed, with everyone eagerly awaiting the verdict. Elijah entered, his demeanor calm and his eyes shining with resolve. Ethan was also present, his face devoid of the arrogance or anger it had once held. He sat quietly, awaiting his fate. When the judge began reading the verdict, the courtroom fell silent. Ethan was sentenced to 6 months of house arrest and mandated to attend cultural awareness and social rehabilitation courses. More importantly, the judge ordered the police department to fully implement the reform proposals presented by Elijah and his legal team. The verdict was not just a personal victory for Elijah, but a significant step forward for the entire community. As the trial concluded, Elijah approached Ethan. Ethan looked at him, his gaze filled with embarrassment. But Elijah simply placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You've started on the right path. Don't let the past hold you back." Ethan couldn't hold back his emotions. His eyes reddened as he nodded, unable to find the words to respond. Outside the courtroom, a jubilant crowd greeted Elijah. But for him, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a much longer journey, a journey to transform an entire system. Elijah knew there was still much work to be done, but he wasn't afraid. He believed that justice, even when delayed, would always prevail. Elijah Walker stepped out of the courthouse into the glow of a late afternoon. As the city was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, the crowd gathered outside cheered joyfully, holding up banners calling for justice and thanking him for his tireless fight. Yet Elijah, his eyes thoughtful and distant, felt a profound sadness. He hadn't sought to turn this into a personal victory. For him, it was a solemn reminder of the long-standing wounds that society needed to heal. Daniel Walker stood by the car, waiting for his father. When he saw Elijah emerge, he opened the car door and helped his father into the seat. For a long time, neither of them spoke as the car pulled away from the courthouse. The silence wasn't awkward, It was filled with the weight of their individual thoughts. "Dad." Daniel finally broke the heavy quiet. "I'm sorry for everything you had to go through. If I'd acted sooner, maybe things wouldn't have gone this far." Elijah turned to look at his son, his eyes gentle but firm. "Daniel, you don't need to apologize. You've done what's right, even when it wasn't easy. I'm proud of you." Daniel could feel the sincerity in his father's words, but unease still lingered in his heart. As the leader of the police force, he knew this case was only the beginning. It had exposed the deep flaws within the system he oversaw. He now faced an even greater challenge: creating change not just to appease public outcry, but to build a police force that was truly fair and humane. After the trial, the community began to sense a shift. Though the reforms were still in their infancy, the commitment from Daniel and other leaders sparked a glimmer of hope. Community meetings became more frequent, providing a space where police officers and residents could have open and honest conversations about issues that had long been ignored. Ethan Miller, once the focus of intense criticism, also began his own journey. During his house arrest, he was required to attend courses on cultural awareness and social equity. Initially, Ethan felt reluctant and uncomfortable hearing stories about the injustices and pain endured by people of color. But gradually, he started to truly listen. One day, during one of the sessions, the instructor introduced a special guest, Elijah Walker himself. Ethan was startled to see him walk into the room. Calm and composed, Elijah showed no sign of anger or resentment. Instead, he shared his story, from his youth marred by discrimination to his relentless efforts to fight for equality. Ethan sat silently throughout the talk. Every word from Elijah felt like a piece of a puzzle, slowly reshaping Ethan's view of the world. At the end of the session, as the attendees began to leave, Ethan approached Elijah. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Walker, I don't know how to express how sorry I am. I just want to say, I'm truly sorry." Elijah looked at Ethan, his eyes kind yet firm. "I don't need your apology, Ethan. I need your actions. Use this opportunity to become a better man." In the months that followed, the reforms initiated by Daniel began to show results. Mandatory training sessions on social equity were implemented across the police department. An independent oversight committee was established, composed of members from various sectors of the community. New recruits underwent rigorous screening processes to ensure they had no history or inclinations toward discriminatory behavior. The community, though still harboring some skepticism, started to feel more reassured by the tangible actions taken by the police force. Many even stepped forward to support Daniel and his team, believing that they genuinely sought meaningful change. Ethan, after completing his house arrest, decided to leave the police force. He knew he needed a fresh start in a space where he could truly make a positive impact. With Elijah's guidance and encouragement, Ethan joined nonprofit organizations focused on helping young people steer clear of violence and prejudice. Elijah, now not just a symbol of resistance but also a mentor for people like Ethan, continued to host speaking engagements. He tirelessly reminded audiences that change doesn't come from one individual but through the collective effort of an entire community. On a quiet evening, Elijah sat in his familiar chair in the small home he cherished. The light from a desk lamp illuminated the memoir he was reading about the civil rights movement. Though his mind wandered to other thoughts, Daniel walked in, carrying a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. He sat beside his father, poured the wine into both glasses, and handed one to Elijah. "Dad," Daniel began softly, "we've come a long way, but I know there's still so much to be done." Elijah nodded, taking a sip of his wine. "You're right. Change never comes easily. What matters is that we don't stop." The two of them sat together, sharing stories from the past and discussing their hopes for the future. While the scars of the past lingered, they knew they had helped make the world a little better. Outside, the city glowed under the streetlights. The streets that had once been the site of so much turmoil were now calmer. A large mural near the neighborhood depicted an image of Elijah Walker, with the words, justice, equality, hope. Under the soft glow of the streetlights, the mural shone brightly, a poignant reminder that no matter how challenging the journey, justice is always the light at the end of the road.